As global demand for African art surges, with auction sales rising 43% to over 70 million US dollars, experts are analyzing whether the continent can retain cultural and financial ownership in a globalizing market. For greater perspective on this, art advisor, founder of ISE-Da, an international art advisory firm focused on the cultural stewardship of Black contemporary art, and Smithsonian National Museum of African Arts Global African Council member Adefolakunmi Adenugba joins us on the line to discuss this shift following her feature on Africa.com. Fola, very good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time. Before we get to, just some of the global sales concerns, when we talk about African art today, looking at its vastness, looking at its diversity, from contemporary painters, sculptures, digital artists, and photographers, the whole lot. What are some of the key trends currently shaping the African art market?
I would say some of the key trends shaping the African art market is increased interest in diasporic connections. People are more interested in work outside of figurative work. People are exploring spiritual and cultural heritage and narrative through African art. And with exhibitions such as Nigerian modernism at the Tate, there's an increased interest in what does modern African art look like and what is the history as it pertains to African modern art.
Yeah, let's talk about the topic at hand. You note that, while global sales of African art surged 43% last year, sales within Africa continue to decline. I mean, what specific policy or even infrastructure changes do you think are needed to ensure that the continent doesn't just export its best treasures?
I can't speak to policy, and I wouldn't say infrastructure changes. I would say that infrastructure is currently changing. One of the things that we're currently seeing is the growth of more galleries being built on the continent, more foundations, residencies, and museums being built. So we're currently in this moment where there's an increase of infrastructure being built on the continent. And this is supporting the fact that even on the continent, in the diaspora, people want to see African art on the ground in various cities and regions. You even see diasporic artists like Yinka Shonobare having shows in Madagascar. You're seeing gallerists such as Dada Gallery opening a space instead of London, opening a space now in Lagos. So there is increased infrastructure that is currently being built. So while export is always going to be important, as it is in any art market, whether it's Africa, the diaspora, outside of Africa and its diaspora, there is increased effort in ensuring that people are coming to Africa to see art on the ground, and that there are ecosystems and infrastructure in place for that to be retained.
And I mean, I would imagine that also segues quite nicely in terms of just the question and the points that have been raised about, the central question about whether Africa can retain cultural and financial ownership. I mean, in your view, what does true ownership look like in a market that is increasingly borderless and digital?
For me, I think ownership has many different levels. I think digital, especially in now 2026, it's increasingly important because having things available digitally, not necessarily to purchase, just to view, allows people to understand what is happening on the continent. So even though I'm African, I'm Nigerian, I grew up across Europe, I'm based in the US, but being able to see things digitally allows me to say, okay, I know what this artist is making. I'm going to do more research. I'm now going to take the time to travel to Marrakesh, to Lagos, or maybe to South Africa to see things in person on the ground. And what ownership also means to me is not only who owns the institutions, but also who's writing about the artwork, who is collecting the artwork. And as an art advisor to platforms such as Africa.com, as an art advisor of my own business, ISE-Da, that's part of the work that I also do, is ensuring that people who have the means to collect are able to own, acquire, and purchase and retain the cultural value of African and African diasporic art. So you have ownership on a written and theoretical level, ownership on who owns physical buildings and infrastructure and galleries, but also who are the curators. They're also people that help contextualize art, whether it's modern or contemporary. So whether or not they're on the continent, you see African curators in museums and institutions in Europe, in the US, and they're putting on incredible shows about African history, whether it's photography, whether it's modernism, making greater connections between Africa and its wider diaspora. So there's so many different types of ownership. It can be physical, it can be intellectual and theoretical, and all of these different types of ownership play their own role into ensuring that African art is owned and controlled and supported in a way that is beneficial to African communities on the continent. And I think we're seeing an increase of that infrastructure and ecosystem being built.
And perhaps maybe touch a little bit about or on, the role of auction houses. I mean, they also play an increasingly important role in shaping the market, as we've seen. I mean, Strauss & Co. saw 26% growth through private sales and online auctions. Just speak to us about the significance of that.
Yes, auction houses are extremely important because they represent really the secondary market. So that means when an artwork has already passed from an artist studio or a gallery to a collector, and maybe they're reselling it. So you're able to see not only works that maybe haven't been on view for the public in a while, but also seeing what is exchanging hands. And so that also helps show what growth for an African artist can look like in the future. But what I think is also really important is that with increase of private sales, you're seeing more people are looking for discretion. They want speed in transactions. And also with auctions, it's a public record. So if an artwork doesn't sell at the price that it's expected to sell, it doesn't sell at all, that's a public mark for that artist, the artwork. And that's something that can affect an artist's market over time. So I think an increase in private sales is important, and not only just for African art, you're seeing it with auction houses across the board, that there is an increase in private sales. Auction houses as a whole, once again, they tell this story, especially about the maturity of an artist's market over time. So for emerging artists, auctions tell a story of what could it be like in the future, what are people responding to, and how they're responding to African art on the secondary market in the future. But their primary focus would be primary market sales, which are for the most part private.
And let's talk about how accessible some of these artworks are, particularly to new collectors. I mean, for someone who loves art but may feel intimidated by the market, what would you say, particularly for first-time collectors who want to start, investing in African art specifically? Where should they even begin?
I'm an art advisor and I help new collectors acquire works by African artists and artists of its diaspora. And what I always tell them to do is you always need to go and see art, whether it's art from a local gallery, a museum, whether or not you want to travel to see art, you need to develop a discerning eye for what you like and what you don't like and understand why that is. And that's how you understand the language, you understand the relationships, the cultural, historical, socio-political, economic context around art, and that's a really good way to start. So the work that I do is I support my new collectors, both domestically and internationally, with these are the different shows that are happening when you're in your city, whether that's New York or London or even in Lagos, or if you're traveling somewhere, let me know, and I will send you exhibitions that you need to visit. But I also make available works at accessible price points. And even artists who are big names in the market, they also can make work that are accessible for new collectors. So I think that it's really important to get your feet wet, to understand and just be in community with people, work with advisors, and just start learning about art on your own terms. And that's always a good way to start. And I also say you shouldn't look at art as a financial investment. And what we say at ISE-Da is look at art as a cultural investment into communities, into cultural production, into the preservation of culture and of history for future generations. And that helps people not approach art as an asset class or as a stock, but to really invest in the artists themselves, the stories that they want to share with the world, whether it's personal, local, regional, diasporic, or what have you. And that's how you help cultivate discerning, intentional collectors who are dedicated to long-term institutional impact for African artists and of its diaspora.
And I want to stay with what you've just said now, particularly the institutional part. I mean, as global interest grows, how do we balance then international appreciation with the need to ensure, of course, that, African art remains rooted in African contexts?
I think it goes back to like an earlier question about this idea of also ownership.
Yeah.
So African art being accessible and legible internationally is always going to be important. But like you said, it is really important to be rooted in African context. So we need to make sure we understand and know who are the people writing about African art, how are they contextualizing it, what are the contexts that they are attributing to this artwork, and also who are the curators that are helping add artwork by African artists to this art historical record and narrative. And that's how we help and ensure that African art becomes rooted in African narratives. And with collectors, they also do play a really important role. And that's why I'm really dedicated to cultivating new Black and African art collectors, because they are going to be purchasing works by African and diasporic artists. And because of that, they may have the relationships with institutions, and they can encourage curators to come to 154, to come to Investec in South Africa, to go to different biennials like in Dakar, to say, okay, these are the artists that I think are really important and they're doing great work. And they are able to advocate for artists the same way advisors advocate for artists and collectors, and then ensure that African artists are not only appreciated internationally, but also have home-based roots as infrastructure grows on the continent.
Yeah. And just from a personal perspective, I mean, just talk to us about, and I mean, I know you've mentioned quite a number of exciting things, but what are some of the artists, movements or even mediums that you particularly think are exciting right now for both, seasoned collectors, newcomers, and the role of partnerships that you've also spoken about in the article with the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art? I mean, how do these then Western institutional endorsements further impact that market value?
Yeah, so one thing I think is really interesting, I'm loving that there is a resurgence of craft and textiles and ceramics around the diaspora, and it's really wonderful to see that. There are a lot of exhibitions that are also prioritizing work like that. And partnerships are increasingly important. And I think what the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art is doing is incredible. So even with the African Art in Venice Forum, partnering with African Art Dialogues and Strauss & Co. So you have an institution on the continent, institution in the US, as well as an institution that's focused on African art discourse, partnering together on a major platform and encouraging people to discuss what is currently happening with African art. It not only allows for African art and artists to increase the exposure and people engaging with their work, but I think what I really love about partnerships like that is that it's showing the importance of cross-continental partnerships and how that is necessary for African art to continue growing the way that it is. So while Western institutions can carry a lot of weight and support for helping an artist market, we're now seeing, because of these partnerships, everyone recognizes the importance of African institutions, whether it's for discourse, whether it's auction, whether it's museums or galleries, in that conversation. And this cannot happen without them. And I really love that the Smithsonian is doing a lot of work with institutions on the continent and more.
Fola, absolute pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Really appreciate your time. Adefolakunmi Adenugba, or Fola, as she's called, speaking us there and joining us just to discuss the shift following that feature on Africa.com. Of course, she is with the African Arts Global African Council member as well.